Dr. Claud Anderson, who's founder and president of the Harvest Institute in Washington, D.C. He's the author of several books, The Black Labor and White Wealth, and his latest book, Dirty Little Secrets. It's a book about black history, its heroes, its troublemakers. The reason why Claud Anderson has been invited to participate on this Issues and Answers show today is because he is qualified. He has been appointed as the Assistant Secretary to the Department of Commerce. He was the chair of the Board of Governors for Southeastern United States Economic Development. He was the Secretary of Education for the state of Florida. And he was the leader of the Action Council that played a very prominent role in helping Jimmy Carter win his first primary. And he was also instrumental in planning for the Democratic National Convention and playing a role with the Democratic Party. Dr. Anderson, you are uniquely qualified to discuss the question of race. Very briefly, before we get into other topics, will you tell our viewers what, in a nutshell, is racism?
As briefly as I can give it to you, racism, unfortunately, is not what we've been focusing on, Paul. It's not a social issue. It's an economic issue. Racism never existed on Earth until the enslavement of black folk, the commercialized enslavement of black folk in the 14th century. Racism is a group phenomenon where one group has acquired so much power, wealth, and resources that it can exploit, Jim Crow, enslave another group of people. It is a competitive situation between groups of people. That's the first thing. Secondly, we need to understand that black folk have never been able to practice racism in this country because we don't own and control a sufficient amount of anything to be a racist. So contrary to what you might hear occasionally on TV where they call a black a racist or Farrakhan a racist, a black person cannot be a racist.
You spoke about what we hear on TV. How would you suggest to our audience and to America how we should frame a debate on this issue on this discussion of race? How should we frame it?
It should be framed in the context of a definition of the word. The root word of racism is race, R-A-C-E. That means race means to be in competition with. It means to be in a contest. Black folk are now competing between whites and blacks. It means there'll be a winner and a loser. Black folk have never been able to compete. And so consequently, if whites have all the resources and blacks have been denied the resource, they're not in a competitive posture to be able to compete with white folks. And when you talk about structural racism, that means that someone has control of so much wealth, power, and resources that black folk are being intentionally excluded out of a competitive posture.
Okay. Congressman Newt Gingrich, the Speaker of the House, and Congressman Tom Campbell from California is now launching this whole discussion that we should focus more on individual rights and individual concerns rather than concerns of race and affirmative action. What do you say about that?
But first of all, they would never touch racism. Racism will run over individualism 1,000 times with nothing left over. Now, the reason whites like to focus on individualism, because they can't, as I just said to you, they cannot be the victim of racism, so they don't understand racism. And that's why in the Constitution it focused on individual this and individual rights. At the same time that was focusing on individual rights, the drafters of the Constitution of the United States, they collectively owned over 1,400 slaves. So they weren't talking about blacks. See, blacks were enslaved as a group. But whites were talking in the Constitution about individualism, and they love to continue to talk about individualism. But black folk must come to understand that their strength, their power, and their group and their wealth potentials rest in their group cohesiveness. They must function as a group. The potentials of a group will spell out and determine your potentials in the society. You can have no more power than your group has.
Okay, well, how do we address, speaking of all these groups, how do we address the issue of race for the black group when there's so many other ethnic groups that are growing in the country? And how do we sort ourselves out? And how do we find a way to focus?
Well, the first thing, we must never compare or equate ethnicity with race. Those are totally two separate things. See, those ethnic groups that you're talking about, by and large, are subcategories of the European race itself. And so consequently, what we see as ethnicity, you'll find out that all those individuals can be French, German, Italians, Greeks, but they are still classified as whites in our society. Every group of individuals who come into this country as immigrants have been classified as whites except Asians, and Asians are now on probation to be very soon classified as whites. The definition of whiteness in America continues to change and expand to make sure that whites stay in the majority population. And so the contest will always be between blacks and whites. That was the origin of racism. Racism never existed, as I said, until the 14th century, and it is a competitive situation between blacks and whites.
What do you say to high school students in Oakland or around the country when they're trying to figure out how do they sort out blacks, Hispanics, Asians, Native Americans, and women in the discussion of the context of affirmative action?
They must understand that that is a dilution process. See, no one, Paul, has ever enslaved and Jim Crowed women, Asians, Hispanics, handicapped, midgets, anyone else. It's the only people have been systematically and customarily excluded out of the economic system, the political system, and the education system has been black folk. So what you got going on in this country now is a conscientious, programmed effort to make sure that anything pertaining to black folk is watered down and diluted and equated out by including everyone else. There's a cardinal rule in social dynamics that says everything that pertains to everybody doesn't pertain to anybody. So what they want to try to do is to make sure that the dominant society feels no guilt and no responsibility for the conditions of black folk by equating it to all these other groups.
Do you think that the dominant society should feel some guilt?
Yes, most definitely they should feel guilty.
And what about, I was riding on the BART train the other day, reading I think it was a Muslim newspaper, and a white man leaned over and said that slavery happened so long ago, and that he wasn't personally responsible, that maybe his great-great-great-grandfather might have participated in it. Why don't we just forget about it? Since he's not personally responsible, why are we holding him responsible?
For a number of reasons. First of all, that's a very, very naive and unwitting position for him to take. He is responsible because he's still enjoying the fruits and advantage of what his great-grandfather and great-grandparents did to black folk. He's living an advantaged lifestyle that comes from the enslavement and the Jim Crowism of black folk. In other words, it's like if I were to put a mortgage on a house and I pass that house on through inheritance to you and you receive that house, there's a bill to go along with it. And for what has happened to black folk in this country, there's a bill attached. And just as Indians laid a claim against the land in America, and that's why we're giving Indians reparations in this country. We've been giving Indians reparations now for over 300 some years because the Indians said, we have laid a claim against this land for what you did to us.
Are you implying that they should give reparations to black people?
Most definitely. And black folks should be coming back now laying a legal claim against the government. Because you see, you never could have had enslavement and Jim Crow in this country for 460 years without the complicity or without the support of government. Every level of government, city, state, county, federal government has participated. They're all co-equal guilty in the fact that they have created these conditions for black folk. And the conditions were not social, they were economic.
Do you have a specific concept outline of a proposal of what reparations requests would look like?
Oh, I got a lot of things. First of all, what first thing I would ask for is that, contrary to what everybody said, always talking about how bad off Indians are, I said, fine, if Indians are that bad off, treat black folk the way you treat Indians. I want the same status that Indians have. So I won't have to pay any taxes. I can get free land. I can get, free health care. I can have a federal Indian bureau. I want a federal black bureau, where the federal Indian Bureau in Washington, D.C. now appropriates on an actuality of about $26,000 a year for every Indian in the United States. When the largest tribe of Indians in the United States, let's take the Cherokee, you got about 150,000 Cherokee Indians. The United States government gives them approximately $170 million a year. I want to be treated like Indians. And what I want this country to do is to classify blacks the same way you classified Indians, put them into a special category, and then turn around and give us land. We got a lot of land in the Department of Agriculture and Department of Internal Affairs, land ownership. I want black folk to go to those land bureaus and get land in this country. We never got to 40 acres and you give us that land. I want black folk to also be eligible to be able to build gambling casinos on any land I can define as black land. Declassify all the ghettos in the United States. And now saying that any blacks living in those ghettos are now exempt from taxes, and second, they can build casinos in there, just like Indians can. Now, the Indians right now got 237 reservations in the United States. They now have 252 casinos. Those casinos bring in profits alone, somewhere between $6 and $9 billion a year. Now, that is more money, Paul, than all 500,000 black businesses in the United States put together. So classify my people as Indians if Indians are so bad off. And I want reparations like Indians.
What about the congressman from Ohio that passed this thing that said that America ought to apologize. And they passed, remember that bill?
Yeah.
Where he said that we are sorry. Do you think apology is connected or should be connected to reparations, or is it relevant?
Yeah, it is very relevant and it's very necessary. Because what it does, it acknowledges something that's been done to black folks. See, right now, they don't want to apologize because for one very specific reason. It would violate the current public policy on black folk. See, and let me take a second to go back to that, okay? Now, see, the historical public policy on black folks started in 1666. They had a public policy on black folk from 1666 until 1966. That 1666 public policy on black folk was called enslavement laws. And that's when all the states began to enslave black folk in 1666. That public policy says black folk in America should be defined as an excluded, subordinated, non-compensated, non-competitive workforce for the personal comfort and wealth building of white society. Let me repeat that so your listeners be able to understand what I'm saying. The public policy that was initiated first on blacks in 1666 that came out of the doctrine of exclusion. It says that black folk in America should constitute an excluded, subordinated, non-compensated, non-competitive work group, a labor force for the personal comfort and wealth building of white society. Now, that policy stayed in effect for 300 years, from 1666 to 1966. In 1966, black folk became obsolete as a labor class. For the first time in this nation, right at the conclusion of the civil rights movement, ironically, black folk became an obsolete labor force.
So you're saying that the 13th, 14th Amendments and the 15th Amendment were irrelevant?
At this point in time, yes, because we're not using it appropriately. When black folk became obsolete in 1966, Paul, what happened, the public policy on black folks shifted then. Since whites now had computer-driven equipment, they no longer needed blacks to open doors, shine shoes, wash dishes, do anything. They then picked up a computer that could do the same thing. So now to alleviate themselves of any obligation to black folk, they passed a new public policy on black folk. And the new public policy, which is still currently in effect in this country, says this, that white folks should feel no guilt for what's happened to black folk, no responsibility for what's happened to black folk or their conditions, and thirdly, they will accept, support, nor or advocate any programs that will redistribute the wealth and resources and power back into the hands of black folk. Because at that point in time, whites in America in 1966 had become 50-foot economic giants, and black folks were 1-foot midgets.
Have you heard of Mr. Ward Connolly?
I've heard the name, yes.
Have you ever had an occasion to appear on a program with him?
No, I have not.
Have you ever thought about debating him?
Well, I could think about debating, but I don't usually debate people for a very specific reason, because I figure most of my opinions are personal opinions, and therefore they're not subject to debate. Secondly, I learned one thing in life a long time ago in all my years in business and politics, is that if I can't convince somebody of the rightness and the accuracy and the timeliness of what I'm saying in 5 minutes, it's a waste of time. Because I mess around with them, they get me to thinking the way they're going, I'll be going backwards too.
Well, I want to know if you could convince me in 1 minute about the Dred Scott decision,
About the Dred
to see
Scott
if it's
decision.
related to the controversies of racism today, and whether the issue of apology of blacks or slavery, that whole apology for slavery context. Can you briefly tell our viewers what the essence of the Dred Scott decision was, and is that in context related to today's need for an apology?
Yes, it is. The Dred Scott decision came out of a situation where you had a black man and his wife had left Missouri and went out of the state for a number of years and worked in labor for a white person. And they went back to Missouri, and he claimed that since he's been out of the state, he'd been in free territory, that in fact he was free. And he just should not have to be returned back to a labor or a subordinated or enforced labor status. And he filed a lawsuit in that effect that went into the federal courts. In 1857, the court ruled that as a black man, since it was an economic issue, that the white man had vested rights. He had investments. He had put money into that black man, so therefore that black man was property based on the Constitution of the United States that defined black people as a slave article, that they have no rights. And so the Dred Scott decision reinforced the United States Constitution, which says black folk are objects of labor, that they are not human beings, that therefore they have no rights. And that was an economic decision. Now, what was supposed to have countered the Dred Scott decision, Paul, was the first Civil Rights Act of 1866, which was put out by, which was promoted, I guess, by Congressman Stevens, Thaddeus Stevens, and Sumter. And what they said to reverse the Dred Scott decision was that said that you cannot free blacks You cannot turn blacks loose into society unless you redistribute some of the wealth and resources to them. What they said is that either a black man's going to be a slave or he's going to be free. But without resources, the empowerment tools, without money, he is still a slave. And they approved that through the United States Congress in 1866. It was vetoed by Andrew Johnson, who came on later, vetoed it. But then Thaddeus Stevens and Sumner went back to the House of Representatives and got it reapproved again, which is still in effect. And what they said is that black folks' rights in this country is an economic right, not a social right, not a civil rights. But then the 14th Amendment came up in 1868. They watered it down at that point in time just to get it enacted into the Constitution. And that time they left out all the economic rights, but the civil rights law is still in effect. And unfortunately, the white power structure in this country and the black power structure has never gone back to the original intent of overriding the Dred Scott decision with the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which says that the problem between blacks and whites is economic. It's not social, it's not political, it's not integration.
Speaking of 1866 and that time, I see you have this book here called Dirty Little Secrets.
Right.
And a previous guest on Issues and Answers was named Reverend John Collins. And he wrote a book on America's Best Kept Secrets. And his book deals with the thesis about the Freedmen's Bank. And you were talking about economics and freedom and the economic. Could you comment on the Freedmen's Bank, on how his thesis is that white Americans set up this Freedmen's Bank and propped up Douglas to take it over after it had failed. And in fact, even though it was a black bank, most of the loans went to white folk. Did you know anything about that historically?
Well, what happened with if you go back to the whole Freedman Thrust and the Freedman Bureau came out of that 1866 first Civil Rights Act. And the primary purpose there again was to bring about economic reparation for black folk in this country. But what happened it only stayed in existence for about 6 years, functioned for about 6 years. So by the early 1870s, it was out of existence. But even in that whole thrust, what they did, they didn't focus on economics for black folk. What they focused on was just education, because the black codes went into effect, and the conservative whites in this country killed the 14th Amendment. They killed the Civil Rights Act and said that best we're going to give black folk is an educational opportunity. So they created these schools, these black schools across the country. But now, what Frederick Douglass got was an opportunity to do something in the banking industry, but he was one of the few that got a chance to do that. But that was sponsored and supported by white money, just like Howard University came out. See, Howard University came out at the same time. Howard University was not initially created for black folk. It was created for the white mulatto offsprings of white congressmen coming into Washington, D.C. That's why they were the only black school that was permitted to have a medical school and a law school. No other black school could have a medical school or law school, because I just told you the national public policy was that black folk could never be competitive with white folk. You could not teach and train black kids to compete with white kids. Now, black schools were to teach black kids to be things like social workers, athletes, or band players, or teachers.
So do you think that integration, this whole move towards integration, you were talking about this focus on education, is that a positive thing or is it a negative thing? And how do we deal with this notion of busing and people chasing people to the suburbs looking for an opportunity to sit next to them to get educated?
Well, see, to be perfectly honest, even though I got enough degrees in human behavior and dynamics and sociology, I don't even understand that thrust. Because, see, integration itself is countermanding any possibility of you ever acquiring power and wealth. You cannot empower yourself at the same time you integrate. Integration, Paul, means disintegration. It means reducing yourself to a microspec. Because in a society where the majority will win and rule and the minority will lose and suffer, why would anybody want to integrate? Integration is making black folk a guest. Integration means I will make you a guest. I will make you a guest in something that's owned and controlled by other people. I'll make you a guest in white suburbs, in white schools, in white businesses, in white organizations, in the white government. See, black folk can never acquire wealth and power as long as they're integrating. And what's going to happen, though, with this whole concept of integration, is going to hold blacks in abeyance until these other groups, competing groups, come in and wipe them out and push them into a subclass structure. Now, you mentioned the busings, for instance. See, that's one of the dumbest things I've ever seen happen. See, my family, as an example, was a part of the family that's the only black bus line that you've ever had in America. The only black chartered bus line you've ever had in America. And that was in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. That was a safe bus company. We didn't have just one bus, 3 buses, 5 buses, or 10 buses. We had over 500 buses. And our buses didn't just service the black neighborhoods. They serviced the black neighborhoods and the white neighborhoods, period. We put the white bus company out of business there. I mean, that was a Duke Power Company. Duke Power Company, named just like Duke University, and Duke Electric Company. We put them out of business because we ran a very competitive bus line. Now, our bus line was vertically integrated for black folk, which gave us a power base, a wealth base, an employment base. We hired our own people. We bought our own buses, repaired our own buses, operated our own buses, had our own drivers, our own mechanics, and we serviced both neighborhoods. But what put us out of business was not our inability for us to compete. It was the fact that blacks decided to integrate down in Montgomery. And when Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks integrated the buses there, rather than going in and buying the bus line from the whites and taking it over and operating it under black control, they decided that it was much better in the context of integration, which was social. Let's just socialize with whites. If whites are sitting on the front of the bus and we're sitting on the back, let's move up front with them and let's integrate with them. Let's intermix and make it a social issue. And so black folk then moved from the back of the bus to the front of the bus. Like, who really cares?
There is a growing number.
But let me finish the point now. Now, here's what happened now. When that movement moved up to North Carolina, and came to North Carolina, the blacks in North Carolina says, we also want to sit on the front of the bus. And in North Carolina, we said, but we don't have any white buses you can sit on the front of the white bus. They said, well, why don't you all get some white buses so we can sit on the front of them? So our bus company went out of business. So then they brought in white buses. Now whites run the bus line. And the same thing happened to our black cab companies and our black movie theaters and our black restaurants. Everything black went out of existence because black folks see integration as being a social issue, and somehow they feel if they get closer to the white society, they're elevating their status, and they're not. They're disintegrating.
There are some people in Oakland and in the Bay Area that feel that the clock is running out, that within a year or two that we will be economically irrelevant, and that we will, in a sense, considering the modern times we now live, we will be functionally back into an economic slavery on an economic plantation. Would you like to comment on that?
Oh, I most definitely feel that's going to happen to you. In this area, let's say the state of California, and a major part of that, you got about $40 billion blacks are generating throughout this state and throughout this city. Now you're looking around the city of Oakland, and wealth, again, what I'm saying, wealth is the problem. What do blacks own in Oakland? Tell me, what do they own? Do they own and control anything of substance? Now, you got all these other groups coming in here. They're in competition with you. They're not here to love you. They're not here to marry you, and marry to socialize with you. They're here in economic competition with you. Now, blacks have been here now. Blacks are the oldest population in this country. Now, show me where blacks own and control anything.
And what do we do to compete? What is your prescription?
The first thing you must do is quit integrating and quit trying to socialize and say you must go back. You cannot build wealth and power until you have a community. Black people in this country are the only people. We are the only people in this nation that do not have one single solitary community. You cannot acquire power and wealth without a community, and yet we do not have one single black community in America. That's from New York to San Diego. At best, all we have are a few residential areas. That's for residential neighborhoods. See, to have a community, you must have 3 things in it, Paul. You must have a wholly independent economic structure, just like you got one down in Asia Town. You must have a code of conduct on how you're going to treat each other, and how you're going to interact with each other, and how you're going to deal with each other and bargain with each other. And thirdly, you must have some form of governance that will control and regulate the behavior of people in your community and deal with other organizations outside your community. Blacks do not qualify on either one of those terms. We do not have communities. So consequently, without a community, you have no place to store your wealth, your value, your history, your culture, your employment, and your business opportunities.
Does your institute, or do you have any literature, or do you have any instructional materials that help lead towards solutioning around community building? How do you put the building blocks of a community together in your analytical structure that you presented?
Yeah, we do that. As a matter of fact, I got a book coming out in probably December, January this year called Powernomics. And then what that book does, it picks up where black labor, white wealth left off. It is nothing. Just like black labor, white wealth defined the problem in America for black folk. Black labor, white wealth. Make it as clear as possible in the title of the book. Black labor, white wealth. You've never been able to acquire any wealth. Now, the second book, Powernomics, also would define the solutions for you. Powernomics, which means you must have economic power to be able to compete. And inside that book, it tells you how you must change the paradigm. You must quit trying to go social, horizontal, social integration. You must start talking about economic integration. Instead of talking about civil rights, you must start talking about black rights.
So your term you would probably agree with called integrating the money?
That's right. You got to move the money around. See, let me give you another point. To show you, see, contrary to the myths in this society, black folk are in the same position they were. You talked about the Dred Scott decision. Black folk are ironically in the same position today as they were during the Dred Scott decision. And on the eve of the Civil War, Paul, black people in America, almost 100% were enslaved. Now watch my point now. Almost 100% of all the black folk in America were enslaved in 1860 on the eve of the Civil War. And they only had 1/2 of 1% of the wealth of this nation. That means that you had 2% of the blacks were free, and those blacks had acquired 1/2 of 1% of the wealth in this nation in 1860. Now, here we are almost 150 years later, where you got almost 100% of all the blacks allegedly free. And guess what the wealth containment is?
Is it 1% again?
1/2 of 1%. Now, how in the world, what's wrong with this picture? How is it that when 100% of the blacks were enslaved, you only had 1/2% of the wealth, and now 150 years later, and when you all 100 supposed to be free, you still only got 1/2 of 1% of the wealth? And it's for a very simple reason, is that the wealth in this nation has been frozen since 1860, it hasn't moved. 87% of all this nation's wealth is inheritable wealth. It is frozen inside the white society. You cannot get it out.
I heard that you spoke at Allen Temple Baptist Church here in Oakland. I understand you're going to be meeting with Dr. Frederick Price. I don't know if you know of Reverend Floyd Flake in New York, and I know there are several ministers in Washington, D.C. you're aware of. What is your comment about the role of the black church as an entity to help facilitate this community building concept you're talking about, this whole powernomics notion, and the role that the church can do to help amass wealth and to create a mindset to start thinking about the world the way you're enunciating it in your books?
I think the church has a very vital role to play. And when I first conceptualized a movement in this country for black folk to change the direction from where we've been going historically to a new direction for economic empowerment, I envisioned I needed at least about 5 major elements to help me. One, I needed somebody who was very good, in legal. So we started filling the courts with some new legal challenges, not on social issues or political issues, but on economic issues, going back to your Dred Scott decision, saying, do blacks have economic rights or don't they? Point one. Point two, I needed someone who was very strong and prominent in politics to work with me as a team member. Point three, I was going to fill as one myself as an economist. Point four, I needed a religious practitioner. Why did I need a religious practitioner? Because I knew that our oldest business in the United States was a church. And it's the most viable, competitive one in the country. But what happens is that we need to be able to change the traditional role of churches. Now, going to why that's important is that I got to get even black ministers out of the traditional posture they've been in now. See, when the evangelical movement started in this country in the late 1790s, at that time, black folk were only permitted to go to church occasionally to accompany in the complement of their masters. And black folk were denied access to religion. But in about early 1800s, when the evangelical movement picked up a lot of momentum, they said, well, maybe there's nothing wrong with us allowing blacks to have their own separate service and have their own ministers. But they said, if we decide to do that, and this started about 1817, they said, here's what we must do. First thing we must do is that as a dominant white society, we must use religion now as a control mechanism. We must make sure that we appoint and pick and choose the blacks who are going to be the ministers, and it must be based on certain qualification, Paul. So they said we will license and pick the ministers, and those ministers once we pick them and choose them and license them, they must do three things. One, they must use the Bible. They must use the Bible to teach the black race that whenever the Bible talked about the slave and the master, they were talking about the white master and the black slave here on earth. Point two, that they must teach black folk to be obedient and hardworking, using the Bible, teach them that, and to accept their lot in life as a slave. And point three, they must use the Bible to teach black folk they would get their pie in the sky hereafter and after death in heaven. And therefore we can use that as a control device. And black ministers did that and used that as a control device for black folk per the orders of the dominant white society up until after the Civil War. When one day, in about 1867, about 119 black slaves on October the 19th, 1867, walked into St. Paul's Baptist Church in Raleigh, North Carolina, and demanded, say, you ministers got to get off your backsides and started trying to help us. We've been released from slavery, poor, penniless, ignorant, no land, no tools, no animals, no money, no home, nothing. You got a responsibility to start to quit using the church to try to control us and do something positive for the community. And at that point in time, the churches then started doing something actively based on that visit. They then they created the benevolent societies. They started creating the first insurance companies. The churches then used their wealth and resources to create the first newspapers in the United States of any consequence, and so on and so on, and started the first banks and everything. But what I'm saying is that now, today, I want to go back into those black churches just as those 119 black slaves went in there and say to them, we need you, you got another obligation. Your new obligation is to move away from where you were even 100 years ago. You must now take on a new responsibility. Point one, you must begin to use your pulpit, from your pulpit to your nursery school, to start teaching black folk economic principles and capitalism in the society and how to acquire wealth and power and resources in our society. That's your obligation to teach every Sunday, and so that our young kids in the nursery school will understand this fully. So when they start attending nursery school, the first thing they will learn is that in our society, that someplace, somewhere, a black person will be producing something, and that's who they would buy it from. That they would love and respect and buy and cherish the things produced by their own people in their own communities. Point two, besides teaching economic principles and brotherhood and how we must buy and support each other. Point two, you must now use that church to attract and draw in wealth into the community and lock it in. You must cease and desist and keep building bigger churches and taking the money from the black folks' pockets and getting big mortgages and buying bigger churches that goes back into the white pocket. You must learn how to draw money into your community and lock it in and hold it. Now, once you lock that money into your community and into your church, what do you do with it? You then, you set up savings unions, you set up credit unions, you set up opportunities for black folk to start business and borrow that money at low interest, long-term loans, so that black folk can now subsidize business opportunities. Point four, you then begin to use your church and get out of the churches and go out and create special kinds of programs to relieve the suffering of black folk in and around your church, to uplift your black community by using the resources that you have in that church that are available to you. And point five, you must also start getting out of the church and using this church to counter all the racism in the society that's coming from the right-wing, ultra-right-wing churches. Groups that are preaching hatred and using the Bible to try to preach black inferiority country. You must stand up on a Sunday morning in church and take them on and say, no, that ain't going down anymore. So you must use your church as a pulpit, a bully pulpit, to protect your people from white racism that's in the church and has always been in the church. Because ever since the first time slavery was organized and codified on earth, it came out of the Catholic Church in 1488, when the Pope put out an edict saying, if you're going to come up with new slaves on the earth, don't pick Indians, pick black folk. And every religion on earth has codified and approved of and supported the enslavement, the exploitation, the Jim Crowism of black folk. That means the Catholics, Protestants, Baptists, Mormon, everybody you name has misused black folk, every religious sector.
Have you figured out a way in your studies of the Bible or religion to show black ministers and our churches how to use the scripture to teach all those positive things that you say the church should be doing? Mm-hmm. Can they get scriptural backup as a way to use the Bible as a tool, as you say, to educate rather than to control?
Most definitely. And I can give you a lot of things myself, but rather doing that, I think some of the best examples would come from Dr. Fred C. Price down in Los Angeles. That's what he's doing. When Dr. Price tells me that God told him to get out of the pulpit and come help me, and he's going to walk with me and support me all over this nation, he's done a phenomenal job of that. And he told me he's going to spend an entire year attacking racism and religion. And he's going to devote his whole sermons from January to December of this year going after it. You got Dr. Cherry in Washington, D.C., who has the next biggest black church on earth. Dr. Fred C. Price has the first biggest. Cherry has the second biggest. And Cherry is going after it on the East Coast, saying, yes, religion has played a major role in the institutionalizing of racism in American society against black folk. Religion has always made it possible for whites to justify what they were doing to black folk.
The League of African American Voters, which sponsors this show, had, as I said earlier, Elder John Collins, a minister, who was essentially pointing out some of the same concerns you are. The League of African American Voters made a commitment, along with the Voices of Legacy, to produce a publication and to work with those trying to spread information like what's in your books and what's in his book to every black church and minister in the country. Would you, since this program is going to be syndicated and sent all over the country, would you make a similar commitment and be allowed to be put on the spot to say that you will help make a contribution, an intellectual contribution to the content of such a publication, so that every black congregation in America could read that message every morning, Sunday morning?
Paul, you know I would, because I love black folk, and I'll definitely do that. But I guess the only concern I have is that you have so many black ministers in America. We have to be realistic now in the context of the racial realities that we live in. We have so many black ministers in this country who've been co-opted and been compromised out. They're presently being controlled either by the economic structure in their city or the political structure in their city. That they are fearful of being black. You got a lot of black churches that do not want to be black. They do not want to talk about the racial realities. And
why is that?
Huh? And
why do you think that is?
And see, I don't know what I could take it back to. I just told you about the history of slavery. I could base it on that, but that's not it either.
You know what? You sound like you're saying that in some senses that the church has functioned in this historical context of the meritorious manumission.
Yeah.
Why don't you explain briefly to our viewing audience what the meritorious manumission was, and is there a connection to what those people who stood up in North Carolina in 1867 in that church and said to the ministers, stop controlling us and help develop the levers of power so we can achieve? Is there a connection to the two concepts?
I think there is, and since you raised, there is some connection. See, the meritorious manumission policy came out in the 1700s, and let me take a few minutes to try to give you a history of that. Going back, let's go back to 1705 because it came out in 1710. Let's go back to 1705. In 1705, what happened was that there was a major effort out of this country to bring more whites into the country to develop this nation. But at the same time, they knew they had to have a black labor force. And blacks began to pour into this nation as slaves. And what they said is we must have, first of all, we must have some form of external control to control these black people coming in the country. So in 1705, they passed what's called the slave codes of 1705. And if you probably heard of the same thing again in 1866 called the Black Codes, okay? But the slave codes told specifically how black folk were to be treated by whites and how black folk were to behave in 1705. That was an external control. But by 1710, they said we got so many blacks coming to this country because we got a good thing going. Because what we're telling all the Europeans is come to America if you want to get rich. If you come to America, we guarantee you're going to get rich because we're going to give you free land and free labor. You got to be an idiot to come to this country and not get rich, and we're giving you free land and free labor. So whites began to pour into this country, not looking for religious freedom, contrary to what the history books are telling you. That's all myth and tales. They were coming to this country to get wealth and power. And as they began to pour in this country in 1710, they said, you know what, to make it easier for us, rather than exercising the external controls on black folk, what if we could build in internal controls into black folk? So the state of Virginia passed a law called meritorious manumission. And what they did, they said, well, here's what we'll do. Let's make black folk responsible for their own behavior. And therefore, we will reward and set free and give some compensation, some money to any black who would do one of four things. One, a black person that would protect a white person's property. Two, a black person who would save a white person's life. Three, a black person who will invent something that a white person can make money off of and will improve the conditions for black making money. And lastly, we reward him if he can squeal on, inform on, or tell on his own people who are plotting any kind of revolt to break free of slavery. And so therefore that was called meritorious manumission. It went into effect by the state of Virginia in 1710. That built in internal controls into black folk. And the first black to give you a award was a black called Nigger Willis down in South Carolina. And that was in 1710. Willie Lynch heard about it, who was operating down in Jamaica at that time. He heard about it. He said, this is a good thing. Let me go to the United States, because I got a history of training and breaking in blacks coming into Jamaica, because the black slaves weren't brought directly into the United States. They were brought in through the islands, and they were conditioned, which means break them in, teach them certain kind of things, break them away from their own family, their culture, their race, and their genders, then bring them to the United States. So Willie Lynch had experience then Paul. So when he said, I'm going to the United States and make some money. And he came into Virginia and said, I heard what you got a new internal control system up here. Let me show you how to put it into effect. I got a plan here. I guarantee you that if I put this plan based on what you all want to do into effect, black folk won't get out of it for 300 years. And ironically, in about another 12 years, that 300 years would have lapsed.
Well, it's interesting that you pointed out about Willie Lynch and this meritorious man you mentioned. There's a mood growing in this country. I don't know if you're aware of it. I know you travel all over the country, but there's a mood in this country where a lot of black folks are starting to say, I'm tired. We are tired of the same old, same old. We hear the rhetoric of integration. We hear the terms busing. We don't have any economic wealth or anything to show for it. Is there an organization or is there a movement that you're aware of that's coming afoot where blacks can start expressing this frustration and channeling it towards something positive?
Yes. I think the basis would be the movement that I've been pushing now for a number of years. That's called the Harvest Institute, coming out of our only black think tank. Also, my Powernomics movement across the country. I think in terms
Is that from the term in the Bible, the harvest is plentiful,
That's
but
right.
the laborers are few?
That's right. That black it's harvest time for black folk in this country. We've been the laboring class now for 460 years. Time for us to come to the table, to the banquet. I think that's the largest movement in the country. And in terms of
How
identification,
big is this organization?
I think in terms of identification and support right now, we are probably bigger than the Urban League, the NAACP, the Rainbow Coalition, and the Muslims put together. As a matter of fact, I don't think there are very many speakers in the United States that pull bigger crowds than I do. In the United States, and these blacks are coming out not because I have that much to say, but they're tired. They're tired of being losers, Paul. They want to say, give us a new direction, give us some new concepts, give us some new justifications for going in new directions, give us some new paradigms, the way we should see things, the way we should behave, the way we should operate in a race-based society, and that's what we try to do. So now we're spreading and we're moving very quickly in this country, and I can guarantee you very shortly, most blacks in this country will have no interest in integration. They can have no interest in civil rights. They can have no interest in voter registration, because all those things we're not playing to win in those areas. Integration, civil rights, and voter rights cannot solve the problem. Neither one of them can restore or redistribute the wealth and resources into black folks' hands.
What do you say to people who describe that notion as separation, as if separation is some kind of disease? How do you respond to them if they say, oh yeah, you sound very intelligent, but you want us to separate?
No, I'm not asking you to separate. First of all, there's nothing wrong with separation. See, the issue back in integration was not separation. It was desegregation, which means stop the government from using its resources to hurt black folk. We never were interested in integration. That's the first thing. Secondly, is that they never apply that term to any other group. Why is it they never apply that term to the Asians and the Jewish communities and the Hispanic communities and all over this country? I got Germantown, Frenchtown, Greek towns, little Italy, little Havanas, little Cubas, little Japans. I mean,
is there something wrong with little Africa?
Yeah, see, that's what I'm saying. Why is it? See, I know what it is. See, because everybody understands that the minute you start allowing people to group, you got the basis of foundation for getting power and wealth. So what they want to do as much as possible is keep black folks segregated, disintegrated through the integration process. But more importantly than that, I had a white fellow ask me back doing integration once in the South. I was speaking, and when I was with the governor's office there, and over education. And this guy came up to me, he said, Dr. Ansley, I heard you talking. He said, but one thing concerns me. He says, it's frustrating to me. I don't understand it. I said, what's the matter? He says, he said, explain this to me. He said, on one hand, you got Martin Luther King running around the country saying he wants integration. He wants to be with whites all the time. And I said, on the other hand, you got Malcolm X over here saying that he wants segregation and separation. He wants to be with all blacks. He said, you all are confused. So what do you want? Do you all want, which end of the stick do you want? Do you want the left-handed stick? Do you want the right-handed stick? I said, I don't want either end of the stick. I don't want either end of the stick. I said, I want my people to have the same rights and prerogatives and privileges as everyone else. You don't ask anybody else. You don't ask Jews or Asians or Hispanics which end of the stick they want. Then why ask black folk that? I said, because in this country, Paul, the bottom line is this. In this country, the issue is not segregation on the right. It's not integration on the left. It's neither one of those two. And I want my civil rights organization to hear me clearly this morning. Read my lips over your TV program. It has nothing in the world to do with integration or segregation. It has to do with aggregation, concentration of your wealth and power and resources to improve the life of your people.
Why are some civil rights leaders so afraid to speak on national television or before audiences about aggregating economic wealth?
Because they're scared the white society will cut off their money, because they know that black folk only have 1/2 of 1% of the wealth, that they got a potential then of keeping wealth in their community. As an example, black folk right now have an annual disposable income, Paul, of approximately $500 billion annually. That makes black folk about the 9th richest nation on earth. Now what black folk are doing they're displacing through what we call flight of capital. They spend 95% of that money outside their own communities. They spend another 3% inside their community in non-black hands, non-black businesses. Black people only keep 2% out of that $500 billion. That means they're trying to live off and survive off of something like about $7 or $8 billion a year. 7 or 8 billion out of 500 billion. Now, if they listen to what I'm saying, and they kept all that $500 billion in their own community, where they historically have been making off only 4 or 5 billion, look at that. That means that black folk will have exposure to more wealth in 1 year. Listen to Claud Anderson, they would otherwise take them 60 years.
Under what you would call in your economic terms, the multiplier effect?
That's right. Keep the money in your own community. In other words, your money is supposed to bounce 8 to 12 times before it leaves your community. Because that's what happens in the white community. In the white society makes the money bounce and pass through other white hands 8 to 12 times before it leaves. Hispanics, money pass 6 to 7 times through their hands before it leaves a Hispanic hand. Jews' money bounce 18 times before it leaves their hand. Black money does not bounce 1 time. Now,
so are you saying we're like a sieve?
You're like a sieve. You're just hemorrhaging to death. So if I can get black folks to understand the importance of keeping the money in their community and making sure that it bounces in other black hands before it leaves, that's a threat to the white community. Because what they're saying now is, oh God, right now any white person can make it.
Why would white people be afraid of, why would black leaders be afraid that white people would get mad at them for that concept?
Because they're more attracted to being accepted by the white society than solving the problems of their own people.
So they want white folks to pat them on the head.
That's right.
Rather than put some money in their pocket.
That's right. And so you know who said it best? There's a white politician, not white politician, but a white political science professor at Harvard University named Andrew Hacker. He wrote a book called Two Worlds Separate and Unequal. Mm-hmm. And what he said he doesn't understand, even as a white person, why black folk are so concerned about what white folks think about them. That blacks are almost paralyzed. They're afraid to make decisions that will enhance the quality of life for their own people because they're afraid that white folks won't like it. Mm-hmm. Rather than simply saying that they don't owe white folks any explanation as what they're going to do to try to improve the conditions of their own people.
That sounds criminal. And in the few minutes that we have remaining, I'd like to get a kind of quick response to about 4 or 5 questions that I want to ask you to sort of get on the record. Crime in the black community. What is your general thesis about a solution and a plan and how we should address that issue?
Very simply, crime comes from a very simple problem. You steal them because you see, there are only 3 things that a person can do in life to earn a living. 3 things, Paul. You either work, go on welfare, or you steal. Now, if you've been denied the opportunities and the tools to work and acquire wealth this way, then you go on welfare. Somebody kicks you off of welfare, you go on to the next level, you steal. And right now, with the little combination of welfare money and the illicit activities in the black community, that's where most of the money is coming from. As a matter of fact, if I were to stop the drug dealing in Washington, D.C. in the black community, where I got about 26,000 young black men selling drugs around Washington, D.C., if I were to cut out the drug selling and the crime around Washington, do you know the unemployment rate in the black community go up by 4%? What option? You give them some option, they'll quit stealing. If you give them the same amount of wealth.
And what options do you say they should give them?
We started make black folk job producers rather than job seekers. Keep the wealth in their community, build their own industries, increase their own tax base, give them the incentives to improve the quality of their schools that relate to them being people who are going to be of worth. In other words, improve the schools so the schools will focus on economics rather than producing athletes and entertainers who are disenchanted with the black community and will alienate themselves in the black communities.
This is probably the one area that we could probably have a whole nother 1-hour show, and that's an area that you're probably most equipped in, and we didn't get into education. Yeah. Very briefly.
The education system right now is dysfunctional in the black community. Going back to what I told you about 1868,
yes.
Through the Freedmen's Bureau, the school systems in America were set up for black folk to produce semi-educated black folk who will work as a labor class for whites. It's never been stopped. See, I don't know why blacks keep operating the schools under a context and a premise that was set up over 150 years ago. You cannot do anything with the black schools until you find out where you want to go as a race of people. If we want to go to the moon tomorrow, and we decide that, now we know how to change our school system. We go back into the school system and say, we want to go to the moon. Now, schools, you rewrite your curriculum so that you can produce more black astronauts, more black physicists, more black chemists, and more, so that we can go into outer space and live there. Now you rewrite your curriculum based on where black folk want to go. Black folks don't have a national plan, not least of all an economic plan. So if you don't have a plan, your schools can't produce what you want.
In the book that you're coming out with called Powernomics, Do you have an economic plan?
Yeah, the Powernomics is an economic plan in and of itself.
So if we want to get the elements of the outline, so in the book that's behind you, to your left there, Black Labor, White Wealth, briefly for within the next 30 seconds, can you tell our viewers what is the general thesis of that book and why they should read it?
That book does what no other book has done in history. It summarizes about what other people put into 1,000 books about black folk. It tells you exactly how we got into our dilemma and how the wealth has been maldistributed and what the major problems are in this society, why we can't get out of it. Then at the end of the book, it recommends a general broad category of all the solutions we need to be looking at very quickly and the timetable we operating under. The new book, Powernomics, will give you all the solutions. And the other book you got in your hand called Dirty Little Secrets, giving you all the little known facts of history about what has happened to black folk that everybody wants to keep hidden.
This
it's
is
called Dirty Little Secrets about black history, black heroes, and other troublemakers. That's the book. That is a powerful little book and giving you some indication of why you can't solve the race problems in America.
I was reading this book and I wanted to know, why did you draw a handkerchief on the head of our Supreme Court Justice? Don't you think that's kind of irreverent to do?
You mean Clarence Thomas?
Yes, sir.
Well, I didn't really draw it on there, even though it's on there. That means that's an Aunt Jemima head rag on his head. That was put on there by Emerge magazine. They gave me authorization to reprint it as one of the Dirty Little Secrets. Clarence Thomas shows up twice in that book. He shows up again as a lawn jockey, where he's standing out, with the thumb up like this, holding a lantern for white society, carrying their water for him.
How does one get in touch with you? Can you give a phone number that we will also run across the bottom of the screen as to how someone can call you? And if you could slowly tell your address and the name of your organization. You may not be used to self-promotion here, but can you give your phone number, your address, and the name of your organization very slowly so that our viewers can write it down?
Okay, let me give you my address first. It's the Harvest Institute. And the Harvest is Harvest. Harvest meaning bringing the fruits to bear to the table to eat, time to share. It's a Harvest Institute. You send any inquiries in writing to 730, that's 11th Street, Northwest. That's in Washington, D.C. That's 20001.
And what floor is it on?
And that's on the 4th floor. And the telephone number there is 202-496-1622.
Do you have, you better repeat that phone number again.
The telephone number, and please call us, particularly even if you could, and especially if you plan on making some donations, because we are a tax-exempt, non-profit institute, and anything you send to us, you can write it off your taxes. So what we're going to ask you to do is send us any kind of a contribution, a donation that otherwise you'd be paying in taxes. Send us the money. We need it desperately to move our agenda across this nation. Send it and call us at 202-496-1622. That's the Harvest Institute. We need your support. Also, we'll send you the list of materials we put out. And if you join the Harvest Institute, there are a lot of benefits you can get, including a regular newsletter which addresses all these issues.
Now, this is an interesting irony. You mean to tell me that if I send you a check for $100, I will be able to deduct it on my federal income tax as a tax write-off, where you will teach me how black folks can gather their money together? The government will allow me to get a tax deduction.
That's right. That's why most of the major white corporations in the United States don't pay any money. And what most people don't understand is we're the only national black think tank that's proactive, putting out prescriptions for black folks' empowerment. But on the other hand, we're running against 1,200 white think tanks that have over 5,000 employees and a $500 million budget. Black folk don't give us money because all your black entertainers and black athletes and your successful black business people, they're scared to give money to anything black.
Have you exposed your concepts to some of our black entertainers and athletes and notoriety folk?
Yes, and they're scared. They say things like, Dr. Anderson, what's the name of the organization? The Harvest Institute. They said, what is it for? I said, for black America. They said, who's going to operate it? We said, black folk. They said, who's going to benefit? We said, black folk. They said, oh, too black. Now, how does something get to be too black? I don't know. Nothing is too Jewish or too Indian or too Asian. But anytime again, I told you, anytime you start pulling black folk together, it becomes too bad.
What about some of the rap stars and some of the musicians? You mean to tell me they say the same thing?
Yeah, a lot of them do, because even a lot of personalities you see on TV every day say the same thing. What they're saying is that basically that they do not want to offend whites by doing anything for black folk.
What about politicians and politics? Farrakhan said at the Million Man March that the day is over just electing somebody just because of the color of their skin, that black America needs to develop a black agenda. What is do you call powernomics a black agenda? And if so, how do you apply it towards politicians in general and politics?
Well, in effect, I wrote it to be a black agenda, but unfortunately, it can be used. You know what? Some of the biggest buyers and procurers of my books are Hispanics. Ironically, and what I'm writing in books, they turn around and using it against black folk. But Farrakhan was absolutely right. See, what black folk have failed to do in politics is never having gotten a contractual understanding between anybody that runs for office. I tell black folk, never, never, never under any circumstance vote for any person, black or white, until you got a commitment from them about what they're going to do for the black community. Not what they're going to do in terms of hiring a secretary or a receptionist, a black secretary. No. One black person did not put them in office. What are they going to do for deliver back to the black community? Politics is a process that decides who's going to get what benefits out of life, and is based on quid pro quo. You take care of me, I take care of you. I've never yet seen black folk demand from black politicians accounting for what they're going to do to the black community. And once you put a person in office, even your current mayor in Oakland, you must ask from him, what are you going to do for black folk in this city? Then secondly, you must call them to task after 1 year time. So you come back before us, you tell us not anything social. You tell us, read us a list of all the money that you have redistributed into the black community. You name all the black millionaires and all the major black businesses that have started up since you've been in office. They can't do that, you pull them out of office.
And does this auditing of elected officials, should this function apply to both black and white
Blacks
politics?
and whites.
Male and female.
Male and female. You go after all of them. You go after them. You use there's devices used like referendums, voter referendums, recalls, and a whole bunch of new techniques that you can do to start pulling them out of office. Do not support anybody that would not support the black community, regardless of their color.
Well, on behalf of the League of African American Voters, we hope that this show will inspire a real and sincere dialogue on the issue of race. And Dr. Claud Anderson, we want to thank you for exposing some of America's dirty little secrets.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and I certainly hope that I can look forward to getting a greater support from the religious sector in this city and the blacks in this city. I do not want blacks to become an underclass. Blacks got about 1.5 years in this city to either pull it together or they're going down for the count.
And as we close, I want to ask you a quick yes or no question. Have you taken this message to President Clinton and John Hope Franklin's discussion on race?
No, as a matter of fact, one of the things that they had made a commitment, Essence Magazine had asked me once to debate with President Clinton last July the 3rd in New Orleans, the race issue. And I said yes, and he had said yes earlier, and he canceled out.
Thank you on behalf of the League of African American Voters.
Thank you.